welcome everybody to the New South Wales DPIRD Dairy Breakfast. And yeah, this is take two. Thank you for your patience as we had to postpone this because of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred. Just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands in which we all, different locations around the state or country. I'm in Yuin country on the far south coast and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today we're focusing on outputs from the storm and flood industry recovery program. It's been a 2-year program that is now, is now coming to an end. And there's been a lot of different tools and case studies that have been developed. They're now largely all sitting on our website, but we are going to focus on 3 of those today. There we are. So we're going to look at the climate risk assessment tool. Blake is going to talk to that. The mini milk biz program, Sheena Carter will talk to that, and the dairy development environmental guidelines. So a few things to get through today. As mentioned, it was part of the storm and flood. There was 12 individual projects overall. We're just speaking to 3 of those today, but as I mentioned before, most of these different outputs from the different parts of the project are sitting on our website. So we will go through the 3 presentations and then we'll keep questions to the end and have a question time at the end. So thank you. I think Blake, you're the next slide. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Ken. Firstly, just wanted to pass on an apology today from Neil Moss, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I'll sort of step in on behalf of Scibus and talk about their project 2B. So their project was broken up into 3 different parts. Basically, what they were trying to understand or get some data and good analysis on was looking at different dairy businesses and which were the ones that were more resilient to adverse climate events during 2019 to 2022. As well as some of those businesses that were more vulnerable. And when we talk about the key attributes of those, it's looking at what the farm physically was like, what were some of the management strategies that they undertook or done prior to the event and during the event, and also how they sort of managed all different aspects of their farm. The second part was to develop some case studies of farmers that originally had exposures or risks to their businesses, and what were some of the mitigation strategies they put in place to overcome these, whether that be during the event, after the event, for the future. And the idea of this was to allow industry, both farmers and service providers, to get a better understanding of some real life examples that saw farmers come out on the better side of these events. And then finally, once they had all this data and analysis of these dairy businesses, was to create a climate risk assessment and mitigation tool for farmers to use now and into the future that will allow them to sort of identify their exposures and risks. And then the second step to that, put in some mitigation options and strategies to help eliminate or mitigate those risks as we face our next climate event. And that sort of rolls in quite nicely is that, unfortunately, as we look over the past 25 years, is that disaster is not uncommon in the dairy industry. And we've got a whole heap of climatic events that have occurred over the past 25 years. So we've had the likes of the Millennium Drought into the 2019 drought, along with the fires, floods, and prolonged wet periods over the recent years. We've also had other industry events, which unfortunately has had a negative impact on the dairy industries across the state, the likes of deregulation, dollar milk, etc. And as we start to head into the future with climate change, where we're seeing that it's likely that we'll see an increase in frequency and intensity of these events. When we combine that with our risk reduced terms of trade, it's driven a lot of dairy enterprises to intensify and increase stocking rates. And with that, they're trying to improve their input use and efficiencies from their inputs. And therefore, we're starting to see potentially businesses become a bit more exposed to these events when they do occur.
Okay, guys, just...
So getting back to the project, Scibus interviewed 27 farms across the state and looking at the New South Wales map on the right-hand side. Where we've got the red dots where participating farms were. So we see quite a lot along the eastern seaboard, as dairy farms are in New South Wales and a few inland. The next is the different shades of blue, and what these are actually the number of natural disasters that these local government areas experienced during 2019 to 2022. So majority of these farms actually experienced 3 declared natural disaster events throughout that period. The farms were a range of different management structures, so owner-operators all the way through to farms with multiple staff. They had varying stocking rates and herd sizes, and also had a range of different feeding systems and production levels. Farmers were given a pre-visit questionnaire, and basically that was just an opportunity for the interviewers to get an understanding of the farm, allow farmers to see allow farmers to express how they were impacted by the events. And then this was followed up by a farm assessment and an on-farm assessment and interview, and done in collaboration with DPIRD. Some of these visits range from, I think, an hour and a half all the way up to 5 to 6 hours. So really comprehensive visits, getting a lot of information from farmers about how they were impacted, getting an understanding of their farms, their management strategies, what sort of physical attributes of their farms, the types of infrastructure they had in place, all sorts of different data that was collected. Just wanted to quickly highlight, and may not be a surprise to many on the call today, but when farmers were asked what the most impactful event of 2022 was actually the persistent wet that they said was the most hardest on them, both physically and mentally, and probably financially for their businesses. So yeah, over 3/4 of farms said that that was the worst period, is when we had those sort of weeks on end and likely months on end actually of wet weather, and not allowing an opportunity for paddocks to dry out really had a toll on their businesses. If we look at some of their data from milk solid production and recovery, Scibus sort of broke it up into 3 different parts that they looked at. So they looked at their initial 3-month drop, which was 3 months post the event. So say the event happened in January, they looked at January, February, March, and then they also compared that to those 3 exact same months the year prior. And on average, there was about a 13% decrease in milk production from those farms. But given there were 27 farms that they interviewed, some of these farms, the worst was actually impacted by more than 58% decline in milk production. Some farmers are actually up 16%, which is a surprise, but that could have been a change in management strategy that they'd undertaken or herd size in those 12 months prior. The 12-month impacts are looking at the 12 months before the event and then 12 months post the event. On average, farms had about a 6% decrease in milk production, but that ranged from anywhere down 33% up to 22%. And on average, it was taking about farms 12 months to recover. Some farms were recovered after 5 months, and others it took over 20 or 21 months to recover. So just when we think about that 12-month impact, it may not 6% may not sound like a lot, but on a 2 million litre farm, it's about 120,000 litres of milk. And when we've got a 80-cent milk price per litre on that, it's getting close to $100,000 that these farms were having their income reduced in terms of from the natural disaster event of the flood. So I'll just take a bit of a breath here and let you all take a look at some of the key findings that influenced either the impact of the event or sped up the recovery. So these were some of the broad categories of farms that were least impacted or were able to recover faster from these natural events. So as we can see, things like having sound management in normal times prepares businesses for times of climate adversity. Being able to quickly dry off or cull low producing cows or problem cows. So being able to prioritise cows that have high production and allocate more feed to them. Maintaining and prioritising reproductive performance. Having some sort of permanent forage feeding facility and cleanable areas that cows can stand, eat and rest was also another key aspect of these farms. keeping cows off the paddocks being too wet, etc., etc. So there were 16 key findings. Not all of them are up here at the moment. We've just sort of squeezed a few of the headline ones in, but yeah, if you're after more information on this, we can definitely send that out to you. So since all that data and analysis was done, Scibus have now developed a climate risk assessment tool. Basically, the overall purpose of this tool is to identify dairy businesses' climate risks and exposures. And what it does is in a couple of slides, we'll touch on what it looks like, but it's basically a self-assessment tool and gives farmers a checklist of different aspects of their businesses to look at and see how they sort of rank or rate compared to these farms that were less exposed or less impacted. It's obviously developed from the over 25 farms that they interviewed in New South Wales, but it also incorporates some really well-researched risk management strategies that are sort of adopted by industry as a whole. Yeah, and in general, and those sort of best management practices. So what's involved? They recommend that we spend at least sort of 2.5 to 3.5 hours doing this risk assessment tool. It is quite a thorough tool. It really does look at the entire businesses and covers all aspects. It gives you a time to sort of self-assess and describe past events, because although that we've had a lot of talk recently about floods, because that's been the most recent natural event that most farmers have experienced. It also will take into account things like drought, heat waves, all of those other aspects of natural disasters that may or may not occur into the future. Once we've done the risk assessment tool, it also sets out actionable plans for farmers. So we may not be able to solve all the issues on the day, but the next step is being able to put you in contact with someone who may or may not be able to assist you with your next step on how to mitigate that risk. And also it can be done on a one-on-one basis or in a trusted group or discussion group with other people, other farmers in your area. So on the left-hand side, this is some of the questions that we go through in the tool. So we look at some of your management practices. So for example, herd vaccination program, do you have one? Yes or no? And then the next sort of step to that is going, well, who is this reviewed by? So, it's great and well that you have a herd vaccination program, but has it been regularly or routinely updated by a veterinarian or someone else to sort of get a second set of eyes on it? The right-hand side is just some bullet points of the different sections that we cover. So we look at networks and communications, what's mobile service internet like on your farm? Where are you getting your information from? Is there a key contact list that staff are able to access? Again, on the right-hand side, some of the other sections that we cover off around, containment and housing, cow production. I put an asterisk there next to financial reserves. That's basically, we do cover on that, but not into any detail at all. What we're trying to understand there is, what are some of your available financial sources that you may have? What's your current financial understanding or position, so that when you get to the next event, how are you placed there? And then looking at the example of some of the questions, we go into a bit more detail about your farm system as a whole. So what is the annualized stocking rate? As we start to get up to over 3.5 to 4 lactations, put yourself at a potentially more exposed. Doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It just means that, have you got a management strategy or risk, or opportunities in place to make sure that if we do get impacted by the next event, how are you going to be ready to face that? And just finally, we've been given the opportunity through the Farm Business Resilient Program to be able to go out and do some one-on-one visits with farmers, or if there's a discussion group in your area that may be keen to undertake this, excuse me, I'm available. So yeah, please, there's my details there. If you know of anyone or you're a farmer yourself that are interested in undertaking a risk assessment tool, then more than happy to come out and do that with you. But yeah, details are there, or reach out to someone else in the DPI dairy team. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Blake. That's great presentation. And yeah, again, if you are interested in having a one-on-one visit on farm, Blake's available to come out and do that. All right, we'll jump into Sheena. You've got control now, Sheena.
Excellent. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Like the tool that Blake was just talking about, this has been able to, Mini Milk Biz has been able to be focused and redeveloped from a tool that was built probably over 20 years ago by the New South Wales DPI Dairy unit at the time. So we've been fortunate to have the opportunity to now update this tool, which has meant giving it some additional functionality and also updating the comparative data that sits behind that for New South Wales. But we've given it additional functionality and we've now got a comparative data for all dairying regions around Australia. So it can be used nationwide. So that comparative data is the dairy farm monitor data averaged over the last 5 years that you're comparing, well, you're not comparing against, you're actually using that in the cash modelling. So if I can get that. So it is an Excel-based tool that looks at the financial position from a cash perspective. It's not a whole farm analysis because we are using some of those comparative figures unless you enter your own data, but we are using some comparative data. The input data that you use is your specific milk production and milk payment, milk income to generate the cash income side of it. And it primarily focuses around feed inputs. So as the feed income, feed costs. All the other herd, shed, and overhead costs are based on that comparative data, unless you've got your own. So it isn't a complete financial assessment of their business, but it gives you a good idea about the position of the business at a point in time. One of the advantages of Mini Milk Biz is that it can be an assessment of any period in time. You can assess it for 1 day, 1 week, a quarter, whatever time period you like. So that can be sort of retrospective, or you can do some scenario analysis looking into the future, primarily around those feed inputs. The reports that are generated then help you identify any areas that might be underperforming and might need further investigation. It doesn't give you the solution, it gives you the tools to identify where these opportunities are, because if you can adjust some or identify where things are limiting in your business at this point in time and then adjust them, it really is the decisions that you make today in your business that will ultimately affect your performance across the whole year. So I said it focuses primarily on feed costs. Why are feed costs important? This graph shows the dairy farm monitor data for New South Wales over the whole 13-year period that we've been doing farm monitor. And the left-hand side is the percentage of homegrown feed in the milker's diet. And what we have seen is while there's ups and downs that have been driven by things like floods that Blake has mentioned, and droughts, and also milk prices had an impact, there's definitely a declining trend in the proportion of homegrown feed being utilised in our New South Wales farms. So we've dipped sort of from just under 60% homegrown feed to around 51% homegrown feed in our milker diet over that 13-year period. So what? Well, the flip side of that is if you've got less homegrown feed in the diet, you're obviously going to have to be bringing feed in. So this is our purchased feed. Again, this is 13 years of dairy farm monitor data from New South Wales, and on the left-hand side is the cost of feed in $1 per kilo milk solids basis. So we've seen that purchased feeds Again, ups and downs depending on seasons and things such as milk price, but an increasing trend over time. Purchase feed costs, therefore impacting our total feed costs. This then has a flow-on effect of impacting operational costs in our business and our cost of production. So monitoring our feed costs is very important, and making sure that we're driving production out of the feed that we're feeding them. So feed costs, when we're looking at our businesses, tend to be around 60% of our farm working expenses. That's sort of the background. Now, I'm not going to step through a spreadsheet on a screen, but I've just got some screenshots to give you a sense of the tool. How you use it, you need to start, obviously it's good to start on the introductory page, but the introduction page explains how you use the tool and explains the different tabs that run along the bottom of the sheet. There's also a quick start user guide. The tool's available on our website, and there's a quick start user guide on that. But if you go into the setup tab to start with, you need to select your milk payment system. So are you paid on cents per litre basis or dollars per kilo milk solids basis? After that, you need to select the region in which you dairy. And this is where that comparative data, the 5 years farm monitor data average, is brought in. So for input, so for income sources such as livestock sales and other farm cash income, so feed sales, things like that, and then herd costs, shed costs, paid labour, repairs and maintenance, and finance costs are also brought in. If you have your own farm data, be that a dairy-based report, a farm monitor report, or a really good chart of accounts that sort of marries up to the dairy standard chart of accounts, there is a custom option down the bottom here, which means you can populate your own costs in the tool. Then you move over to the data tab, and this is where you start entering things like the period of analysis. So that is a date range from and to. If you are entering the data just for one day, your from and to dates are the same day. Then you need to enter some land areas for your milking platform. We are primarily focusing on the milking platform here. Average body weight of your milkers, and then the production related stuff. So the number of cows that are contributing to the milk sold that day or for whatever period, and the fat and protein test, and also your milk price. Then over on the right here, there's a few numbers that go in here around estimated pasture growth rate, grazing rotation, bulk milk cell count, days in milk. Those numbers don't really go anywhere. They're more for context when you're interpreting your report, or when an advisor might be interpreting your report. Then you enter all your feeds. So this button up here actually expands these columns, and once you click on these columns, you get a drop-down menu of different feeds which come from a feed library. As you select the feeds, the nutritional value of the feeds pops in over on the right, and then you just have to enter the quantity of feed fed per cow per day, or you can enter it in tonnes per day, and the price of the feed in that period. If you're grazing pasture, the pasture consumption is based on a back calculation, but you need to select the species that they're grazing and the proportion that that makes up of the pasture. Then we jump into some of the reports. So we have a cash predictor report, and we're calling it a cash predictor report because it's not a true cash flow report. We're looking at this comparative data, which is just based on those average figures for that period. So true cash flow is going to be by month and actually reflect the expenses that you're incurring specifically in that time period, whereas this is just averaged. But the milk income and the feed costs are the actual costs in that period of analysis, because that's being pulled from what you have entered in the data tab. The farm working expenses and farm operating cash surplus are then calculated. So all these other costs are from the comparative data, and all the terminology here actually aligns with the standard dairy industry terminology that we've got at the moment. So this is similar to what you'll see in a dairy base or dairy farm monitor report. So the green highlight on the homegrown feed costs and purchased feed costs is what we call conditional formatting, and we've got that in a few spots throughout the reports just to flag some things that you might want to consider. So this green for feed costs indicates that your total feed costs are less than 60% of farm working expenses. Then we've got a daily KPI report, which has a lot of information on it, but we've got margin over all supplementary feed costs. So that's your purchased feed and conserved homegrown feed. Then we've got margin over total feed costs. So this is highlighted green in this instance because it is saying that so your margin over all those over the total feed costs, that means, you know, in this instance, you've got $3,316 that day to cover all the other cash costs in the business. If it's green, it's indicating that it's enough to pay the cash costs in our cash predictor report. Then this one down here is our production per cow per day required to cover all the costs, including finance costs. And green indicates that the cows are producing enough to cover all those costs. Then the percentage of production from homegrown feed. Again, there's a green, orange and red cells depending on the proportion of homegrown feed that you've got. And it's really around sort of risk management and flagging that perhaps, you know, if it's not above 60% and it falls below that range, then there is potentially risk in your business with exposure to things like the purchased feed market. Then there's this one-page summary report, which obviously has a lot of detail on it, but there's a production summary, which is really around what the cows are producing in that period of analysis, or that day actually, litres or solids per cow per day and per hectare per day. Our financial summary gives a quick look at income per cow per day and our feed costs per cow per day, down to margin over feed costs per cow per day. The diet summarises things like dry matter intake and things like pasture. So if you've estimated the pasture growth rate, the calculations will work out an estimated consumption rate. So if utilisation rate, if your pasture utilisation is less than the estimated pasture growth rate, that will go green, indicating that the pasture is growing faster than what the rate at which you're eating it. And, you know, there's obviously management decisions you can make around that. It'll be red if it's the inverse. So if you're consuming the pasture faster than what it's actually growing, bearing in mind that is an estimation and it's based on a back calculation. Then there's a nutrition, high-level nutrition summary and a feeding summary on quantities being consumed and the cost on a dollars per tonne dry matter basis. Then down to that total feed costs for the period, and the green on that is indicating that it is feed costs are under that 60% of farm working expenses. Then you can see there's some other great sort of summaries around your diet or your ration composition that you're feeding at the moment, and some summaries on the cost structure and various other things that you can dig into. So there's a lot of information in those reports that are going to be based on either what is actually happening in the business today or for the period that you've analysed, or if you are interested in looking at some of the feed costs, some of the feed inputs, and particularly in times of drought and potentially flood, you might be looking at alternative feed sources. While it's not a ration formulation tool at all, it will help you understand some of the implications from a cash perspective around different scenarios with different feed inputs. So like the risk management tool that Blake was talking about, we have funding through the Farm Business Resilience Program to help farmers engage with Mini Milk Biz. So there's funding for some group sessions and also one-on-one sessions for farmers if they'd like to reach out, and I can certainly help support farmers and others with that. And if you would like to download the tool, you can scan that QR code, or it's you can find it on the web link which has been put in the chat as well, but that will take you direct to Mini Milk Biz on our webpage. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing.
Just before you go, so the circumstances which a farmer may choose to use this is, for example, if milk pay rate changes and they can look at what the impact would be on their business, or if they've got a new feed source that they want to utilise and they can see if that's, so they're sort of examples of where a farmer might use it.
Yep, absolutely. And, bearing in mind you need to do some of that scenario analysis with caution, and understand that there's a lot of dynamics at play in a dairy business when you're changing inputs. That's why I say it's not a ration formulation tool. There's great tools for that, or nutritionists to sort of verify that you might get the anticipated production. But yes, you can absolutely use it for that purpose, and modelling what might happen with that lower milk income or higher milk income, whatever the case may be.
Shannon? All right, we'll go to Zita Ritchie. Zita's going to talk about the Dairy Development Environmental Guidelines, which were released at the end of last year. So I'll hand over to you, Zita.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Yeah, so as Ken mentioned, the update to the New South Wales Dairy Development and Environmental Guidelines was released at the end of last year. And this is actually an update from the guidelines that the department published in 2008. And there was a lot of work that went behind this over about a 2-year period. And I'd like to particularly call out Marguerite White, who's on the call today as well, and also Claire Fitzpatrick, who dedicated a lot of time and technical input into bringing these guidelines together with input from our team, and as well as the land use planning team and DPIRD as well. So it's been a really great process. So the project was actually funded by the Storm and Flood Recovery Program, and we had an industry reference group which had technical representation from consultants and industry reps. And, it was really driven from industry with the support of Dairy New South Wales, so managing the program as well. And we had a lot of input from farmers throughout this process to really understand what the key issues and challenges were in the industry at the moment in terms of farmers looking at investing and developing on farm. So it was really, I guess, a great project to engage industry, and it's really been driven by industry to update these guidelines. So it's been a great result to get to this point. So the link to the guidelines is in the chat, but I'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Blake. So I guess the update to the guidelines has really come about through, and I guess, a number of industry challenges, which many of us on the call are aware of, and trends that we're seeing. So as we're aware, we've seen a decline in the number of dairy farm numbers across Australia and New South Wales over the last decade or more. And I guess, but similarly, we've seen an increase in the average herd size of dairy farms as well. And I guess this has meant that farm systems are changing, and there's different requirements that farms are needing to accommodate those additional cows on average across New South Wales. And so I guess that's a challenge with farmers, is having to reassess, well, do I invest in new infrastructure or develop or change farming operations to accommodate that? We're seeing, a decline in rural populations, which is not unique to dairy specifically, but I guess across agriculture and the competition for labour. And, it's a sector-wide problem in dairy, problem or challenge is attracting and retaining labour on farm. And then as well, which is what Blake and we've all been talking about, is kind of the influence of climate. So if we're likely to, see more extreme and frequent climatic events, how farms are managing this risk on farm. So I think, in response to all these challenges, farmers are considering investing in improving infrastructure or looking at their operational changes or redeveloping their existing site to manage these risks going forward. So I guess that brings us to planning and development. So if farmers are required to develop and upgrade their systems, I think, you know, farms are always adapting and changing, and we want to be able to facilitate and support that into the future so they remain viable and manage those risks into the future. So I think managing that investment phase and that development phase is critical, and not only from supporting farmers and, you know, the planners or consultants that might be supporting them to go through that process, but also for councils to understand, you know, why the industry is looking at these changes and considering investment and changes on farm in infrastructure. So that's come through as a very strong need to kind of bridge that gap and make sure that we, can support that process as best as possible. And so it really came through, you know, with talking to farmers and those that were on our reference group, understanding what the key challenges were with many that had undergone this planning process. And, you know, many had experienced delays in development applications, and, you know, it's not always a clear process. So understanding what those challenges and issues were and really trying to address those in the guidelines in a very clear, in the clearest way we could to support that going forward. So what does the guidelines capture and what's it trying to do? I think, well, just to call out also that it's a New South Wales based guideline for the dairy industry, but it has really strong alignment with the national guidelines. So the dairy feed pads and contained housing guidelines were released by Dairy Australia a couple of years ago now in collaboration with Agriculture Victoria. And it's a really comprehensive national guidelines. It's a fantastic document. And so we really wanted to ensure that we're using the same terminology and had really strong alignment with the national guidelines. So the New South Wales guidelines do refer to those as quite commonly throughout the document. But I guess its ultimate aim of the guidelines is to reflect modern dairy systems and really address those challenges that I mentioned before around labour, climate risk, welfare, and, you know, changing market demands, which is leading to, you know, farmers looking at infrastructure and technology changes and moving forward. The guidelines is also there to update, provide an update of the New South Wales planning environmental regulatory frameworks and, you know, key aspects that farmers will have to navigate and understand when they're looking at undertaking a development. But it also provides practical advice with the planning and application phase. And there's also a farmer checklist at the end of the document. So if farmers are looking to go through a development application, what are the key aspects they have to address in those applications? And then also Chapter 9 has a really comprehensive focus on more of the operational requirements and best practice when we're planning, implementing and operating dairy developments going forward. So it's a really comprehensive document. So just to touch on it in a bit more detail, what does it cover? There's a lot of industry terminology that we use, and we wanted to make sure that those terms and definitions are well understood, particularly, you know, with councils or consent authorities and planners that aren't familiar with dairy, to have that kind of key terminology clearly articulated in the document. So both farmers and councils and consultants are using all the same language. We describe, you know, the different types of dairy systems and likely types of development. So that might be changing to more, that might be dairy housing, as well as feeding infrastructure or upgrading the dairy facilities itself as well. It goes through the planning and organising a development. As I mentioned, the New South Wales planning framework. So there's a few really great diagrams in there. It's kind of a ready reckoner. So depending on what kind of dairy system that you're running, what pasture-based or more contained intensive system, what pathway you might need to go through, as well as the key aspects of lodgement and environmental requirements that you might need. So environmental protection licenses or other environmental management plans or things that you might need to cover off on there. And as I mentioned, Chapter 9 is really around more best practice and environmental kind of guidelines there for the industry. So yeah, feel free to look on the link and you'll be able to see that in detail. But I think I'd just like to mention too that I think with, you know, some farms might only undertake a dairy development on their farm, you know, once in a generation. So it's not like farmers are going through this process very regularly, and it can be quite, I guess, complex and a lengthy process. So I think the key thing to take away really is it's really important that if farmers are considering a development to really gather that team of experts or that trusted sources of advice around you to navigate that process to start with. So, you know, if that might be getting a planning environmental consultant, or if farmers are looking to go to more a contained housing system, a facilities designer to allow for that. So really building that team to help them with this process. And then, like, there's another, just a little graphic as well, that if you just click across. So if, once you've got that team established, then that'll help you determine what kind of assessments or requirements that you might need for your particular development. And not all those ones on the outer curve there will be needed, but depending on the level of complexity and the type of development you might. So again, I mentioned contained housing, or if farmers looking to go to a contained housing intensive system, odour assessments or modelling might be needed. You know, Aboriginal cultural heritage understanding on your land, and there might be different requirements for traffic, and those types of assessments might be needed. So it can be a whole range of things. So it just really outlines that there is a lot to a dairy development depending on the type, and just building that team around you is critical. So where you can get this information, I provided the link in the chat. We do actually have a limited number of hard copies. So Blake and I have sent a few of these out to different service providers and farmers. We do have some available. We don't have a lot, so you probably can't put an order in for 100. But if anyone on the call would like their own copy, or know a farmer that would benefit from having a hard copy, please get in touch and we can mail that out to you. Also like to mention that on the 1st of Feb, we released a podcast, the Business of Dairy podcast, and we had Claire Fitzpatrick, who's really experienced in this space and was critical also in helping to develop these guidelines, and steps through the chapters in more detail and common challenges and planning aspects that come up with a dairy development, and goes through it in a lot more detail than what I have here, which is really useful. So please, feel free to download that or pass it on to a farmer that might find that useful, that's going or thinking about going down this pathway. So yeah, that really wraps up the guidelines. So, and then just to mention as well, there's a couple of other supporting tools and resources, or workshops as well, that's out there. So if coming soon from the department is the My Farm Planner tool. It's been in development for a while now, but I've been told that it'll be coming out in the next couple of months. So what this is really, it's a complementary tool to the guidelines, where it'll be a web-based tool where farmers can enter in their address, and it can bring up their farm spatially on a map. And depending on the type of development that they might be considering, will bring up the different overlays and frameworks that will be needed in addressing or to starting out with an application. So providing some pointers there very early on. So that'll be a really great, excuse me, complement to the guidelines. And then Dairy Australia runs a workshop called the Farm System Evaluator, which is a fantastic 1 to 2 day workshop, which is probably best if farmers just considering starting out and is thinking about, you know, upgrading or changing their dairy farm operation, what pathway they might want to take or consider. This is really great decision-making process, and looking at, all right, what are the steps that I might need if I was to go down this pathway before they've decided on a system. So that's a workshop that's run through Dairy Australia. So feel free to get in touch with DA. There has been a few workshops in New South Wales already run last year on that. But yeah, it's a really fantastic course. So I think those 3 resources together really place the industry in a really good position going forward to help with facilitating and supporting farmers undertake developments on farm. So that really wraps up that kind of summary of the guidelines. But as Ken mentioned on the front slide, the Storm and Flood program has funded a lot of activities and work over the last couple of years. So we've mentioned a few of the key things that have come out in the presentations today. So the climate risk assessment tool, mini milk biz, and the guidelines are just 3 of a number of outputs in a number of projects. But I'd just like to call out again that a lot of these are housed on our website, which is provided in the first link in the chat. We've got an emergencies and risk management tab, which has a lot of resources. So one of them, I've got a screenshot here, is the Dairy Emergency Response and Recovery Plan on a page. So it's an A3, could be an A3 poster. Again, I've got hard copies if there's any farmers that you know that would like to have a poster like this, but kind of takes, you know, preparedness, response and recovery actions with different preparing for emergencies. But we've got a number of farm case studies that came out of the interviews that Scibus and DPIRD held. And so there's a lot of written and video case studies from farmers really sharing their experiences from the last few years, and what assisted in their recovery and planning going forward. So we've got case studies. We've also delivered a few community flood plans across the state, and also a water insights kind of predictive tool that was piloted down in Bega, and looking to expand that out also to a couple of other regions. But that's just to note a few other activities and outputs that have come out of the program. So a lot of work's gone into it, but I thought that probably wraps up the session there on the guidelines and some of the outputs. But if there's any other questions, and also Marguerite, I know you're on the call, don't mean to put you on the spot, but if there's anything you'd like to call out or mention, feel free in terms of the guidelines. But I hope that gives everyone a bit of an overview of what the guidelines was, what's involved in the guidelines and the other projects as well. But thanks, Ken.
I'd just like to, before we go to questions, these programs really came about because of partnerships. The climate risk assessment tool was working with Scibus, and the New South Wales Dairy Development Guidelines were project managed by Dairy New South Wales, and the mini milk biz wouldn't be we wouldn't be able to invest in it if it wasn't for this funding and the support of people who've tested it for us. So thank you for all those people who have been in the background making this possible and supporting us in getting the delivery done. So the guidelines, Zita, they're available on the website. Sheena, the mini milk biz is a downloadable spreadsheet available on our website. So a service provider, for example, could download it and take it away and use it on farm. And Blake, we haven't yet got the risk assessment tool online. We are rolling it out on farms, just making any final adjustments and learning any final lessons in that sort of pilot phase, but it will be available. I imagine by mid-year, we'll have that available on our website. But if you particularly want the climate risk assessment tool, then reach out directly to Blake and myself, and we'll be able to organise, a farm visit, specifically because we're really keen to roll it out on farm. All right. Well, are there any questions that people have for the team? And you can put questions in the chat as well.
Can I just make a comment, Ken?
Yes.
Just with the mini milk biz, when you download it off the website, it is an Excel-based tool and it does have macros in it. This is all very technical, but you actually need to follow the instructions. You'll get a warning if macros aren't enabled on your computer, and there's instructions to step you through that. But just be aware of that. And if you do have issues with it, please reach out and we'll help fix it up. It's just a thing with spreadsheets in Excel these days, unfortunately.
There's a question from Ewan in the chat. Zita, I might throw this to you.
Yeah, sure. Happy, Ewan, to give you an update there. Yeah, so look, as part of the response, Dairy New South Wales and Subtropical Dairy called about 62 farms across the far north coast to mid north coast, just getting a bit of an assessment of impacts. So as part of the response, the department, we stood up the Dairy Emergency Management Leadership Group. So that was really just to quickly assess what kind of impacts were experienced across the region. And so that data has been fed up to the Reconstruction Authority, which has been really useful just to get a bit of an idea of the impacts that have been sustained across the dairy industry. So that's just a bit of background about where we are in terms of just collecting data. In terms of what's been announced, so it's been classified as a Category B disaster. So with that has what's been made available is the transport subsidy up to $15,000 for farms in those. I forget how many LGAs, is it 20? I'd have to just double check, but they're on the RAA website of what eligible LGAs are there, and also concessional loans available for those impacted LGAs. So that's the what's available at the moment. In terms of what might come, I can't say, I'm not sure, but collecting that information in impact data is really important. So if there's any further impacts or damage that you'd like to report, please let me know. But also to encourage farmers to fill out the PINDA form, so the Primary Industries Damage Assessment Form. I don't know, Ken, or if someone can quickly find the link and put it in the chat. But that's really important. So the Reconstruction Authority and government are always looking for those damage estimates. They're coming in daily. So it's actually a live kind of spreadsheet that you can actually access publicly, and it records damages to stock, pastures, crops, all different kind of aspect, fencing, all that infrastructure damage. So that's really important with recording the impact of the event and what potential further support or assistance might come. So yeah, really encourage any dairy farmers to submit that form. But the data that was collected from Dairy New South Wales and Subtropical has been really valuable in giving those initial kind of estimates of the impact. And I guess in terms of support too, just like to mention that there's a lot of, I think everyone's probably quite aware that having gone through a lot of events previously in the last few years, there's a lot of mental fatigue out there. So there are mental health services available. Maybe after this webinar, I might be able to share some of those contacts. So as a service provider, if you're going out to any of these farms and want to refer anyone on to further support, we can provide that information. But also please get in touch with Rasheen or myself or Dairy New South Wales in terms of what other extension or support you think that industry might need at this point in time. We can take that on and look at addressing that moving forward as well. So I hope that helps.
Leader, hopefully that answers your question, Ewan. Are there any other questions? Again, we are available anytime if you'd like to reach out and ask any further information. Encourage you to have a look at our website. We've refreshed it, and particularly so that we could house all this new information, all of the outputs, case studies, tools, in a way that's a bit easier to navigate. So if you do have time to go have a look at our website, you'll be able to access those resources there. And okay, see.
Yeah, Ken, I'm Brenda here.
Hi,
Dairy
Brenda.
Australia. Yeah. A question for Sheena. I was wondering with the mini milk biz, if that can be used with any sort of pest situation on a farm. For example, if you can run the program or the tool the previous years or the previous couple of years, and then if you've got an infestation on that particular year, you can run it again. And then can you use it to look ahead as to what sort of feed I buy in, or whether I use chemicals, or you can use it as a predictor, but also just to have a look at what it's now costing you for the milk, because I'm thinking she said the feed cost was 60%, or it needs to be above 60%, sorry, below 60% of the business. Can we use that as, if we do have a problem with pest? Would that work?
Not really, Brendan. No, I mean, the variables that you're playing with are in mini milk biz are related to milk price and milk production and feed inputs. That's the only things that you're manipulating, and it doesn't really have that granularity for an analysis on that. I think you'd need to be looking at some other tool to understand that. You can certainly do modelling around, if you're having to purchase in more feed. Again, bearing in mind it's not a ration formulation tool, but you can look at the cash impact of that on the business, but it doesn't. You can't really do sort of modelling with losses in pasture production and those kind of things with it. The pasture utilisation calculation in it is based on a back calculation, which is the same as Dairy Farm Monitor and Dairy Base. So it looks at all the inputs in terms of feeds that have been fed to the herd. So whether that's purchased concentrates, purchased hay or silage and your homegrown hay and silage. So we know the energy value of those feeds and the energy value, the energy required to produce the amount of milk that they're producing. So once you subtract the feed energy values that we know from that overall energy requirement, that leaves us with an energy deficit in a pasture-based system. And when you enter the pastures, select the pastures, the feed library has the energy value of those pastures. So it works out based on that, how many tonnes of dry matter the cows are potentially utilising from pastures. So you can't actually say we've got less pasture available. That's not quite how it works.
Thanks, Sheena. Appreciate it. Understand.
Is there a tool, Sheena, that would do that?
We've got the old maize calculator tool, which isn't on our website, but you can enter specific costs related to maize production. So that would be, any additional applications that you're putting on to control pests. And I guess you could use that to potentially model sort of increased costs or decreased costs, and there's sort of sensitivities around dry matter production, so it might be able to be used on as a sort of case study approach, I guess, Ken.
We might have a look at updating that maize model and getting it on the website.
Yeah.
Can it be used, Sheena, for anything besides maize, or is it only specifically tailored for maize? Any other crops or?
I'd have to have a look at it again. You could probably use it for any sort of forage crop. You've just got to, I would have to look at it again. I think Brenda,
Sorry,
just
on the spot with that one.
I've looked at that for a while. Yeah, you'd have to just change your, I think, your predictions around dry matter yield, I think.
Okay, we can talk about that later. Thanks, Sheena.
Sure.
I can't see any other hands up or questions. All right, thank you. Thanks, Blake, Sheena, and Zeta for your presentations today. And again, if you have any questions that you think of later in the day, you can always reach out, send us an email. There's our dairy, it's our dairy email, which is on our website. You can find us, or you can send one direct to either any of us. Other than that, have a great day. Thanks for, again, your support, and hopefully these tools are going to be useful for industry. That's why we develop them and put a lot of time and energy into them. So any feedback on them, any way we can help, continue to improve them, would be most welcome to get that feedback. So thanks again, and have a great day, everyone.